The locomotive's whistle pierced the crisp October air as it rounded the final bend toward Willowbrook Station. Sarah Mitchell pressed her gloved hand against the frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out at what should have been her new home. What she saw instead made her stomach drop like a stone thrown into a deep well. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Empty buildings lined what had once been a bustling main street, their windows dark and lifeless as dead eyes. Weathered signs creaked in the mountain wind, their paint peeling away like old skin. The platform where she expected to see her future husband waiting stood completely deserted, weeds growing through the cracks in the wooden planks. This wasn't the thriving mining town Samuel Hayes had described in his letters. This was a graveyard of broken dreams and abandoned hopes. The train shuddered to a halt with a grinding screech of metal on metal. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. 6 months of correspondence, carefully planned arrangements, and a life-changing journey from Boston had led her to this moment of crushing realization. She had traded everything familiar for a phantom, a mirage that dissolved the moment she arrived. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she clutched the leather portfolio containing Samuel Hayes's letters, each one promising a prosperous life in the booming silver town of Willowbrook, Colorado. The words that had once filled her with excitement now felt like cruel mockery. "The mine produces more silver than we can ship," he had written just 3 months ago. "The town grows larger every week, and I need a wife to help me build an empire in this land of opportunity." The conductor's gruff voice broke through her paralysis. "End of the line, miss. Willowbrook Station. All passengers must disembark." Sarah rose on unsteady legs, gathering her 2 worn carpet bags and the small trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. The other passengers had departed at previous stops, leaving her as the sole arrival in this ghost of a town. As she stepped onto the platform, the autumn wind cut through her wool coat like a blade, carrying with it the scent of decay and abandonment. The conductor handed down her trunk with barely concealed impatience. "You sure this is where you meant to be, miss? Ain't nobody lived here regular like for near on 6 months now. Mine played out, and folks scattered like leaves in a storm." Sarah's voice caught in her throat as she tried to respond. 6 months. That coincided perfectly with when Samuel's letters had stopped arriving. She had attributed his silence to the difficulties of frontier mail service, never imagining that the entire town had simply ceased to exist as a functioning community. "Is there anyone left at all?" she managed to ask, though part of her dreaded the answer. The conductor scratched his grizzled beard thoughtfully. "Well, I did see smoke coming from the old general store last time through. Might be someone still kicking around, but I wouldn't count on it being your intended. Most of the men who stayed behind after the silver ran out weren't the marrying kind, if you catch my meaning." With that ominous warning, he climbed back aboard the locomotive. Sarah watched in growing panic as the train pulled away, its whistle echoing off the surrounding mountains like a funeral dirge. The sound faded until only the wind remained, whistling through the empty buildings and rattling loose boards like skeleton bones. Standing alone on the platform, with her possessions at her feet, Sarah felt the full weight of her situation settle upon her shoulders. She had burned every bridge in Boston to come here. Her position as a seamstress in Mrs. Pemberton's shop had been filled the day after she gave notice. The cramped boarding house room she had shared with 3 other girls now housed someone else. Even her sister Ruth had married and moved to Philadelphia, starting a new life that had no room for Sarah's complications. The letters from Samuel Hayes had arrived at the perfect time, when her world had grown small and suffocating. 26 years old and considered a spinster by Boston society, Sarah had felt invisible, forgotten. a piece of furniture that no one noticed anymore. Samuel's proposal had offered her something she had never dared dream of, a chance to be essential to someone, to build something meaningful from nothing. Now, surrounded by the skeletal remains of Willowbrook, she realized how naive she had been. The West wasn't a land of infinite possibility for everyone. Sometimes it was just another place where dreams went to die. Sarah picked up her bags and began walking down the main street, her boots echoing hollowly on the wooden boardwalk. Most of the buildings stood with their doors hanging open or missing entirely, their contents long since looted or claimed by the elements. The barbershop's striped pole lay broken in the dirt. The hotel's second-story balcony had partially collapsed, creating a jagged wound in the building's facade. But as she approached the general store, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Thin wisps of smoke drifted from the chimney, barely visible against the grey October sky. The windows, though dusty, appeared intact, and someone had nailed boards across the lower portions, as if to keep the elements or unwanted visitors at bay. Sarah hesitated at the door, her hand raised to knock. What kind of person remained in? A dead town? The conductor's warning echoed in her mind, but she had nowhere else to go. The next train wouldn't return for 3 days, and she had barely enough money for a ticket back to Boston, even if she had somewhere to go there. Taking a deep breath, she rapped her knuckles against the weathered wood. The sound seemed to reverberate through the empty street, announcing her presence to whatever ghosts might still haunt Willowbrook. For a long moment, nothing happened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then she heard movement inside, the scrape of a chair, heavy footsteps approaching the door. "Who's there?" The voice was rough, suspicious, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Definitely not the refined tones she had expected from Samuel. Hayes's letters. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm looking for Samuel Hayes. I was supposed to meet him here." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind, rattling the loose shingles on the roof above. Finally, the voice responded, softer now, but still wary. "Samuel Hayes has been dead for 4 months, miss. Fever took him in June, along with half the folks who were still here when the mine closed." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her vision blurring as the full reality of her situation crashed over her. Samuel was dead. The town was dead. She was stranded in the middle of nowhere with a stranger who might or might not mean her harm. I don't understand," she stammered. "His letters. He was writing to me just 3 months ago about wedding plans." The door opened a crack, revealing a single weathered eye studying her with a mixture of suspicion and what might have been pity. "You're the mail-order bride he was expecting. I found some of your letters in his things when I was settling his affairs. Figured you'd gotten word somehow and changed your mind when the letters stopped." Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank onto her trunk, her carefully constructed future crumbling around her like the abandoned buildings of Willowbrook. She was stranded, nearly penniless, in a ghost town with winter approaching and no way to support herself. The door opened wider, revealing a tall man with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His clothes were clean but patched, and his eyes held the kind of wariness that came from too much hardship and disappointment. Despite his rough appearance, there was something in his expression that wasn't unkind. "Name's Thomas Carter," he said, stepping onto the small porch. "Tom, mostly. Samuel and I were partners in the general store before things went bad. I've been keeping an eye on his place, figuring his family might come for his things eventually." Sarah looked up at him. Through tears, she couldn't hold back any longer. "I gave up everything to come here. My job, my room, everything. I don't have anywhere to go." Tom studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She could see him weighing his options, probably wondering if helping her was worth the complications it would bring to his already difficult life. A part of her wanted to tell him not to bother, that she could take care of herself. But the truth was that she needed help desperately. "Winter's coming on fast up here in the mountains," he said finally. "Next train won't be through for 3 days, and there's weather moving in that could delay it longer. You can't stay out here." He gestured toward the interior of the store. "Samuel's quarters are in the back. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. You're welcome to use them until you can figure out what comes next." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. "I can't impose on you like that. You don't even know me." "Don't know many people anymore," Tom replied with a bitter smile. And Samuel would have wanted someone to help. His intended bride, even if things didn't work out the way he planned. As Sarah gathered her belongings and followed Tom into the general store, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of man chose to remain in a dying town when everyone else had the sense to leave. The interior of the store was surprisingly well maintained, with shelves still stocked with basic supplies and a small living area carved out in the back corner. A pot-bellied stove radiated welcome warmth, and the smell of coffee lingered in the air. "Why did you stay?" she asked, as Tom helped her settle her trunk near a simple cot that must have been Samuel's bed. Tom was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret and determination. "Samuel, and I sunk everything we had into this place. When the silver played out and the town started dying, most folks cut their losses and moved on, but I couldn't leave. Not with so much invested, not with winter coming and nowhere else to go." He paused, staring out the small window at the empty street. "I keep thinking maybe the mine will produce again. Or maybe someone will find a new vein. Probably foolish, but a man's got to hold on to something." Sarah understood that kind of desperation, the refusal to let go of a dream, even when all evidence suggested it was time to move on. She had done the same thing, clinging to the fantasy of Samuel Hayes and their life together long after his letters stopped coming. As night settled over Willowbrook like a heavy blanket, Sarah lay on Samuel's cot, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the buildings. Tom had retired to his own quarters on the other side of the store, giving her privacy, but remaining close enough that she didn't feel completely alone in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. She would have to figure out how to get back to Boston or find some other way to support herself. But tonight, for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt a small measure of safety. Tom Carter might be a stranger and this might be a dead town, but at least she wasn't facing the unknown entirely alone. Outside, something rattled in the wind, a loose board or piece of metal that had broken free from one of the abandoned buildings. The sound was lonely and mournful, like the ghost of Willowbrook itself, mourning for the life that had once filled these empty streets. Sarah pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes, trying to imagine what tomorrow might bring to this place where dreams had come to die. Sarah awoke to the sound of someone moving around in the front of the store, the gentle clatter of dishes and the creak of floorboards pulling her from an uneasy sleep. Pale morning light filtered through the small window above Samuel's cot, revealing frost crystals that had formed on the glass overnight. The air in the back room was cold enough that her breath misted when she sat up, but she could hear the crackling of a fire being stoked in the main area of the store. She dressed quickly in the same traveling clothes she had worn the day before, smoothing her skirts and attempting to tame her auburn hair into something resembling respectability. The mirror above Samuel's washstand showed a woman who looked older than her 26 years, with worry lines etched around her green eyes and a pallor that spoke of too many sleepless nights. When she emerged from the back room, She found Tom Carter standing near the pot-bellied stove, stirring something in a cast-iron pot that smelled surprisingly appetizing. He had cleaned up since the previous evening, his dark hair combed back, and his face freshly shaved. In the morning light, she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 30, with strong hands that moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared breakfast. "Morning," he said, without turning around, though she hadn't made any sound that should have alerted him to her presence. "Coffee's ready if you want some. Food will be done in a minute." Sarah accepted the tin cup he offered her, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it helped chase away the last vestiges of sleep and the lingering disorientation of waking up in a place that felt like the edge of the world. "You didn't have to cook for me," she said, settling onto one of the wooden crates that served as chairs around a makeshift table. "I don't want to be a burden." Tom finally looked at her, his grey eyes assessing but not unkind. "Wasn't any trouble. I was cooking anyway, and it's been a while since I had someone to share a meal with." He ladled what appeared to be a thick porridge into 2 bowls, adding a generous dollop of preserved fruit that made Sarah's mouth water despite her anxiety about her situation. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin bowls and the occasional pop from the fire. Sarah found herself studying Tom when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to understand what kind of man would choose to remain in a dying town when everyone else had fled. His hands were calloused from hard work, but his movements had a careful precision that suggested education or refinement somewhere in his past. "What did you do before you came here?" she asked finally, curiosity overcoming her natural reserve. Tom was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee as if it might hold answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. "I was a teacher," he said eventually, "back in Ohio. Had a little schoolhouse outside of Cincinnati, taught reading and arithmetic to farm children mostly." Sarah felt a spark of recognition, a sense that she was seeing past the rough exterior to something more familiar underneath. "What brought you west? Teaching is steady work." "Steady, yes, but not particularly lucrative." Tom's expression grew distant, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone recounting a painful memory. "I had plans to marry, start a family, but my intended decided she preferred a man with better prospects, someone who could give her the kind of life she wanted." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy. She understood the sting of broken promises, the way hope could turn to ash in an instant. "So you came here looking for those better prospects?" "Samuel wrote to me about opportunities in Willowbrook, said they needed someone to help run the store, someone who could keep books and handle correspondence. The pay was good, and there was talk of the town needing a proper school once it got established." Tom's laugh was bitter. "Seemed like a chance to build something real, something that would last. And now?" Tom gestured toward the empty street visible through the front window. "Now I'm the fool who stayed too long at a party that ended months ago." Sarah set down her spoon, studying the man across from her with new understanding. They were both refugees from disappointment, both people who had gambled everything on a future that hadn't materialized. The difference was that she still had a choice about what came next, while he seemed trapped by circumstances and stubborn hope. "The next train comes through tomorrow afternoon," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about what to do." Tom's expression became carefully neutral, but she caught a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been disappointment. "Boston's probably looking pretty good right about now." "Actually, I can't go back to Boston. There's nothing left for me there." Sarah took a deep breath, surprised by the words that came out of her mouth. "I was wondering if you might need help here. Someone to cook, keep house, maybe help with the store if anyone ever comes through to buy anything." Tom stared at her as if she had suggested something completely insane. Miss Mitchell, I appreciate the offer, but you don't understand what you're saying. Winter up here is harsh, and it's likely to be a long one. The town is dead. There's no future here for anyone, let alone a lady from Boston who's used to civilization. Sarah felt a flare of irritation at his assumption about her delicate nature. I may be from Boston, but I'm not made of spun glass. I worked 12 hours a day in a sweatshop before I saved enough money to become a seamstress. I can handle hard work and harsh conditions. This isn't about hard work, Tom replied, his voice growing heated. This is about survival in a place where the nearest neighbor is 2 days' ride away and the snow can trap you for weeks at a time. What happens if one of us gets sick or injured? What happens if the food runs out or the store burns down? What happens to you if I leave? Sarah shot back. At least with 2 people, there's someone to help if things go wrong. Tom fell silent, clearly struggling with the logic of her argument. She could see him weighing the practical benefits against the complications of having a woman in his already precarious situation. Finally, he shook his head. It wouldn't be proper. You're an unmarried woman and I'm... He trailed off, as if realizing the absurdity of worrying about propriety in a ghost town. Samuel Hayes intended to marry a woman he'd never met based on letters and a photograph, Sarah said firmly. I'd say we're well past conventional propriety at this point. Before Tom could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the street outside. Both of them froze, listening as the horses came to a stop somewhere near the front of the store. Sarah saw Tom's expression change, wariness replacing the frustration that had marked their conversation. Stay back, he said quietly, moving toward the front window and peering carefully through a gap in the boards he had nailed across the lower portion. We don't get many visitors, and the ones we do get usually aren't the friendly type. Sarah heard voices outside, at least 3 men from the sound of it, talking in low tones that didn't carry clearly through the walls. Tom's hand moved instinctively toward a rifle that leaned against the wall near the door, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Looking for someone to trade with, one of the voices called out, loud enough now to be clearly heard. Saw smoke from your chimney. We've got goods to sell, fair prices. Tom didn't respond immediately, and Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders as he tried to decide how to handle the situation. In a town with law enforcement, unexpected visitors might be merely inconvenient. Here, with no sheriff and no neighbors to call for help, strangers could represent serious danger. What kind of goods? Tom called back finally, his voice carefully neutral. Supplies, mostly. Food, ammunition, tools, things a man might need to get through the winter. Sarah moved closer to the window, trying to get a look at the visitors without exposing herself. Through the gap in the boards, she could see 3 men on horseback, their faces shadowed by hat brims, but their posture suggesting they were more accustomed to taking what they wanted than engaging in legitimate trade. I'm not interested, Tom said, his hand tightening on the rifle. You'd best move along. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat and the distant sound of wind moving through the empty buildings. Finally, one of the horses moved, and she heard the creak of leather as one of the men dismounted. Now, that's not very neighborly, the voice said, closer now, probably just outside the door. We've ridden a long way, and we're not asking for much, just a chance to show you what we've got. Tom looked back at Sarah, his expression grim. She could see him calculating odds, trying to decide whether to trust these strangers or prepare for trouble. The fact that he was even considering it told her everything she needed to know about how desperate their situation had become. I'll look at what you have, Tom said finally, but I stay armed and we conduct business outside. Fair enough, came the reply, though Sarah detected an undertone that made her skin crawl. Tom moved toward the door, pausing to look back at her one more time. Stay here. And stay quiet. If things go bad, there's a back door behind the counter. Follow the alley to the old church and wait for me there." Before Sarah could protest, Tom had unlocked the door and stepped outside, the rifle held casually, but ready. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, straining to hear the conversation that began immediately. "Name's Jake Morrison," one of the men said, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that made Sarah's skin crawl. "These are my associates, Pete and Charlie. We're what you might call traveling merchants." "Tom Carter, what are you selling?" Sarah heard the sound of something heavy being dropped to the ground, probably saddlebags or a pack. "Bit of everything. Flour, salt pork, coffee, even got some ladies' things if you've got a woman to trade for." The casual mention of women's items as trade goods made Sarah's blood run cold. These weren't legitimate merchants. They were scavengers at best, predators at worst, and she was suddenly very glad that Tom had armed himself before going outside. "Where did you get all this?" Tom's voice had grown colder, more suspicious. "Here and there," Morrison replied with a laugh that held no humor. "People leave all sorts of useful things behind when they move on. We just make sure nothing goes to waste." Sarah understood now. These men were looters, probably following the train routes and picking clean any settlements that had been abandoned. They had seen the smoke from Tom's chimney and assumed they had found another easy target. "I'm not interested," Tom said firmly. "I'd appreciate it if you'd move along." "Now hold on there, friend." Morrison's voice had lost its false friendliness, taking on a harder edge. "We've come a long way, and we haven't had a proper meal or a warm place to sleep in days. Seems like you've got both, and it wouldn't kill you to share." I said no. Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked, followed by Tom's sharp intake of breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the situation had just turned deadly. "Here's how this is going to work," Morrison said, his voice now openly threatening. "We're going to take what we need, and you're going to let us. If you cooperate, nobody gets hurt. If you don't, well, there's nobody around to hear the shots anyway." Sarah's mind raced. Tom was outnumbered and outgunned, and she was the only person who could help him. But what could she do? She had no weapons, no experience with this kind of violence, and any attempt to intervene might just make things worse. Then she remembered the back door Tom had mentioned, and an idea began to form. If she could circle around behind the men, she might be able to create enough of a distraction for Tom to act. It was dangerous, probably foolish, but doing nothing seemed even worse. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah made her way to the back of the store and slipped out through the rear door. The alley behind the building was narrow and cluttered with debris, but it offered cover as she crept toward the front of the store. She could hear Morrison still talking, his voice growing more impatient. "Charlie, go check inside. See if our friend here has been holding out on us." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. If they searched the store, they would find evidence that she had been staying there, and that would complicate everything. She had to act now, before the situation spiraled completely out of control. Picking up a piece of broken wood from the debris in the alley, Sarah threw it as hard as she could toward the far end of the street. It clattered against the side of an abandoned building, the sound echoing off the empty structures like a gunshot. "What the hell was that?" she heard one of the men say. "Pete, go check it out," Morrison ordered. "Could be someone trying to sneak up on us." Sarah held her breath as she heard footsteps moving away from the store. Now there were only two, men confronting Tom instead of three, slightly better odds, but still dangerous. She needed to do something more dramatic, something that would give Tom a real advantage. Looking around desperately, her eyes fell on an old rain barrel that had been left behind one of the buildings. It was large enough to make a significant noise if it fell, and it was positioned where it might look like someone was trying to flank the men from the other direction. Sarah crept toward the barrel, every footstep sounding thunderous in her ears, despite her efforts to move silently. Just as she reached it, she heard Morrison's voice again, closer now and filled with suspicion. "Tom, I think you've been lying. To us. Charlie says there's women's things in your store, and I'm starting to think you've got company in there." Sarah's blood turned to ice. They had found evidence of her presence, which meant Tom was in even more danger than before. Without hesitation, she put her shoulder against the rain barrel and pushed with all her strength. The barrel toppled with a tremendous crash, rolling down the slight slope of the alley and slamming into the side of another building. The sound was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, loud enough to suggest that someone with a gun was moving into position. "There's more of them," she heard one of the men shout. In the confusion that followed, Sarah heard the sound of Tom's rifle firing, followed by cursing and the thunder of horses' hooves. She waited in the alley, her heart pounding, until the sounds faded, and she heard Tom calling her name. When she finally emerged from her hiding place, she found Tom standing in front of the store, his rifle still ready but pointed toward the ground. The three men were gone, though she could see dark stains in the dirt that suggested at least one of them had been wounded. "Are you hurt?" she asked, rushing toward him. Tom shook his head, but his face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "That was you making all that noise, wasn't it?" Sarah nodded. "I thought if they believed there were more people around, they might think twice about pressing the issue." Tom stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he began to laugh, a sound that held equal parts relief and admiration. "Miss Mitchell, you may just be the most resourceful woman I've ever met," he said. "That was either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Sarah admitted, "but it worked." Tom's expression grew serious again as he looked down the empty street where the men had disappeared. "They'll be back, probably with more friends. Word will spread that there's still someone living here, and not all of our future visitors will be scared off by falling barrels." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had thought they were safe in their isolation, but now she realized that being alone also made them vulnerable to anyone who chose to prey on the weak and defenseless. "What do we do?" she asked. Tom was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through their options. When he spoke, his voice held a new note of determination. "We prepare. Winter's coming anyway, and we'll need to be ready to defend ourselves if we're going to survive out here." He looked at her directly, his grey eyes intense. "That is, if you're still planning to stay." Sarah thought about the alternative, about running back to Boston with her tail between her legs, about admitting defeat and accepting whatever scraps of life she could find in a world that had already rejected her once. Then she thought about the way it had felt to work alongside Tom, even in those few dangerous minutes, the sense of partnership and shared purpose that she had never experienced before. "I'm staying," she said firmly, "if you'll have me." Tom nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had arrived in Willowbrook, Sarah saw something in his expression that looked like hope. "Then we'd better get to work," he said. "Winter waits for no one, and neither do men like Jake Morrison." As they walked back into the store together, Sarah felt something shifting inside her, a recognition that she had passed some kind of test. She wasn't the same frightened woman who had stepped off the train yesterday. She was someone who could act under pressure, someone who could be counted on when things got dangerous. For the first time since leaving Boston, she began to believe that maybe she could build a life in this harsh, unforgiving place. It wouldn't be the life she had imagined when she first read Samuel Hayes's letters, but it might be something better. It might be something that was truly her own. The days that followed Jake Morrison's visit transformed the rhythm of life in Willowbrook's general store. What had been a solitary existence for Tom and an uncertain refuge for Sarah became something neither of them had expected, a genuine partnership built on necessity and growing trust. Sarah woke before dawn each morning to the sound of Tom stoking the fire, the familiar ritual now marking the beginning of their shared day. She had taken over the cooking duties without discussion, finding satisfaction in creating hearty meals. From their limited supplies, Tom had protested at first, claiming he didn't want her to feel obligated to serve him, but Sarah had pointed out that cooking for two was hardly more work than cooking for one, and it freed him to focus on other preparations. Those preparations had become Tom's obsession. Every morning after breakfast, he would venture out to scout the surrounding area, checking for signs that Morrison and his men had returned. He set up simple warning systems using cans filled with pebbles, strategically placed so that anyone approaching the store would likely trigger an alarm. Sarah watched him work with growing admiration for his methodical approach to their defense. In the afternoons, Tom began teaching Sarah to shoot. He had found an old pistol among Samuel's belongings, a serviceable weapon that wasn't too heavy for her to handle effectively. Their first lesson had been awkward, with Sarah flinching at the sound of gunfire and Tom struggling to explain the mechanics of aiming and firing without overwhelming her with technical details. "Don't think of it as a weapon," he had said, steadying her hands as she aimed at a makeshift target they had set up behind the store. "Think of it as a tool, like a hammer or a saw. It has a specific purpose, and when you use it correctly, it does what you need it to do." Sarah had found his calm, patient instruction surprisingly reassuring. Back in Boston, the idea of holding a gun would have horrified her. Here, with winter approaching and dangerous men potentially lurking in the surrounding wilderness, it felt like a necessary skill, no different from learning to preserve food or repair torn clothing. By the end of the first week, she could hit the target more often than not, and Tom had declared her competent enough to defend herself if necessary. The compliment had filled her with a pride she hadn't expected, a sense of capability that was entirely new to her experience. The evenings had become Sarah's favorite time of day. After the chores were done and the store secured for the night, she and Tom would sit by the fire, sharing stories of their former lives and their hopes for the future. Sarah learned that Tom had grown up on a farm in Ohio, the youngest of 4 brothers, and that his decision to become a teacher had disappointed his father, who had expected him to stay and work the land. "Education was my way out," Tom had explained one evening, whittling a piece of wood while Sarah mended one of his shirts. "I knew I wasn't cut out for farming, but I didn't want to end up in a factory either. Teaching seemed like a way to use my mind and still contribute something worthwhile to the world." Sarah had shared her own story more reluctantly, the details of her life in Boston seeming small and insignificant compared to the challenges they faced daily in Willowbrook. She told him about the cramped boarding house where she had lived, sharing a room with 3 other working women, and about the long hours in Mrs. Pemberton's sewing shop, hunched over delicate fabrics until her back ached and her eyes burned. "I wasn't unhappy exactly," she had said, struggling to explain the restlessness that had driven her to answer Samuel Hayes's advertisement. "But I felt like I was disappearing, becoming invisible. Every day was exactly like the one before, and I couldn't see how anything would ever change." Tom had nodded with understanding. "That's why I came west too, I suppose. The promise of something different, something that would matter." "Do you think we're fooling ourselves?" Sarah had asked. "Trying to build something meaningful in a place that everyone else has abandoned?" Tom had been quiet for a long moment, his knife pausing in its steady rhythm against the wood. "Maybe," he had said finally, "but I'd rather be a fool with hope than a wise man without it." Their conversations had revealed the depth of their shared determination to make their arrangement work, despite the obvious challenges. Sarah had begun to understand that Tom's decision to stay in Willowbrook wasn't just about the money he had invested in the store, though that was certainly part of it. It was about proving to himself that he could succeed at something difficult, that he could build a life on his own terms rather than accepting whatever circumstances offered him. For her part, Sarah had discovered that the skills she had learned in Boston were more applicable to frontier life than she had initially realized. Her experience with a needle and thread proved invaluable when it came to repairing their clothing and gear, and her ability to stretch limited resources into satisfying meals had impressed even Tom, who had grown accustomed to subsisting on whatever was easiest to prepare. The work itself had become a source of satisfaction that surprised her. Back in Boston, her labor had felt meaningless, just another small contribution to someone else's prosperity. Here, every task had immediate and visible results. When she preserved vegetables from the small garden behind the store, she could see their winter food supply growing more secure. When she patched Tom's coat, she was directly contributing to his ability to work outside in the cold. The connection between effort and benefit was immediate and tangible. 3 weeks after Morrison's visit, their routine was interrupted by the sound of the approaching train. Sarah had grown accustomed to the twice-weekly arrival of the locomotive, which rarely stopped for more than a few minutes to drop off mail or the occasional piece of freight. This time, however, the train's whistle blew the long, mournful blast that indicated passengers would be disembarking. Tom and Sarah exchanged glances across the breakfast table, both thinking the same thing. In all the time Sarah had been in Willowbrook, she had been the only passenger to arrive, and Tom couldn't remember the last time anyone had gotten off the train before her arrival. "Could be Morrison coming back," Tom said, moving toward the window to peer out at the platform. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. They had prepared as best they could for another confrontation, but she still hoped they wouldn't have to test their defenses against determined attackers. The train came to its usual shuddering halt, and they watched as the conductor helped a single passenger down to the platform. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that it was a woman, middle-aged and respectably dressed, with a large traveling bag and an air of determined purpose that reminded Sarah of herself on that first day. "She's lost," Sarah said with certainty, "just like I was." Tom was already reaching for his coat. "We should go meet her before she gets too confused about where she is." They approached the woman cautiously, not wanting to startle her, but also aware that appearances could be deceiving. Sarah had learned to be suspicious of strangers, a habit that would have seemed paranoid in Boston, but felt entirely reasonable in their current circumstances. The woman looked up as they approached, her face showing a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She was perhaps 45 years old, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't immediately place. "I'm looking for Dr. Margaret Fletcher. I was told she was practicing medicine in Willowbrook." Tom and Sarah exchanged another glance. There had been a doctor in town during the mining boom, but like most of the other professionals, he had left when the silver played out. "Dr. Fletcher left months ago," Tom said gently. "The town's been mostly abandoned since the mine closed." The woman's face fell, and Sarah could see her struggling to process this information. "But I received a letter just 2 months ago," she said, reaching into her bag to produce a worn envelope. "She said she needed an assistant, someone with nursing experience." Sarah felt a familiar pang of sympathy. Here was another woman who had traveled across the country, chasing a promise that no longer existed. Another person whose carefully laid plans had been destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. "I'm afraid there's been some mistake," Tom said, his voice kind but firm. "There's no doctor here anymore and no medical practice." The woman stared at the empty platform, clearly trying to decide what to do next. Sarah could practically see her calculating her limited options, weighing the cost of a return ticket against the possibility of finding some other opportunity in this desolate place. "My name is Margaret Fletcher," Sarah said, stepping forward. "I'm sorry you've come all this way for nothing." Margaret looked up sharply, her eyes focusing on Sarah with sudden intensity. "You're not Dr. Fletcher. You're far too young," and she specifically wrote about her years of experience treating frontier ailments. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. The letter Margaret held wasn't from a doctor at all. It was another piece of Jake Morrison's operation, designed to lure women to isolated places where they would be vulnerable to exploitation or worse. The realization that Morrison and his men were actively working to bring victims to Willowbrook made her feel sick. "Ma'am," Tom said carefully, "I think you may have been the victim of a deception. There are men operating in this area who aren't what they seem, and they may have been using Dr. Fletcher's name without her knowledge." Margaret's face paled as the implications of Tom's words sank in. She looked around at the empty buildings and deserted streets, suddenly seeing them not as signs of economic hardship, but as evidence of something more sinister. "You mean someone deliberately tried to lure me here under false pretenses?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded grimly. "We had a run-in with some men a few weeks ago who seemed to be involved in that kind of activity. They're dangerous, and they specifically mentioned having women's items to trade." Margaret sank onto her traveling bag, the weight of her situation clearly overwhelming her. She had come west with the same hopes that had driven Sarah, looking for a chance to use her skills in a place that needed them. Instead, she had nearly walked into a trap that could have cost her everything. "The next train doesn't come through for 2 days," she said, more to herself than to them. "And I used most of my money for the ticket here." Tom looked at Sarah, and she could see him weighing their options. They had barely enough supplies to get themselves through the winter, and adding another person to their small community would strain their resources even further. But leaving Margaret to fend for herself wasn't really an option, especially if Morrison and his men were still in the area. "You can stay with us until the train comes," Sarah said, making the decision for both of them. "It's not much, but it's warm and safe." Margaret looked up with grateful tears in her eyes. "I couldn't impose on you like that. You don't even know me." "We know enough," Tom said firmly. "And we could use another pair of hands if you're willing to work for your keep." Over the next 2 days, Margaret proved to be exactly the kind of person they needed. Her nursing experience included basic medical knowledge that neither Tom nor Sarah possessed, and she immediately began organizing their supplies with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing limited resources in difficult circumstances. More importantly, she brought news from the outside world that helped them understand the broader context of their situation. According to Margaret, there had been reports of similar scams throughout the territory, with isolated communities being targeted by groups of men who preyed on the vulnerable and desperate. "It's not just about robbery," Margaret explained, as they work together to inventory their medical supplies. They're trafficking people, especially women. The railroad makes it easy to move victims from place to place, and towns like this are perfect because there's no law enforcement to interfere. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. She had thought Morrison and his men were simple thieves, dangerous, but ultimately interested only in whatever valuables they could steal. The reality was much worse. "We need to warn people," she said. "Other women might be getting letters like the one you received." Margaret nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing, but how do we get word out from here?" Tom had been listening to their conversation with growing concern. "The railroad," he said suddenly. "The conductor knows every stop on the line, and he talks to people at every station. If we could get him to spread the word about what's happening here, it might prevent other people from falling into the same trap. When the train arrived to collect Margaret, they were ready with a detailed letter describing Morrison's operation and warning other potential victims to verify any offers of employment or marriage before traveling to remote locations. The conductor, a gruff but decent man named Williams, had been horrified by their account and promised to share the information with his colleagues and the authorities at the larger stations. Margaret's departure left Sarah and Tom alone again, but the brief presence of another person had changed something fundamental about their relationship. Working together to help Margaret had felt natural and right, confirming their growing sense that they functioned well as a team. "She was right about one thing," Tom said as they watched the train disappear into the distance. "We do make a good partnership." Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the store behind them. "I was thinking the same thing." The encounter with Margaret had also reinforced their understanding that they couldn't remain passive in the face of the threat Morrison represented. He wasn't just a danger to them personally, he was actively working to harm other innocent people, and they were in a unique position to do something about it. That evening, as they sat by the fire discussing their plans for the approaching winter, Sarah broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "We can't just wait for Morrison to come back," she said. "He's going to keep sending letters, keep luring people here, and eventually someone is going to get hurt." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking the same thing, but what can we do? There are only two of us, and we don't even know where he's based." Sarah had been considering this problem for days, and she thought she might have an answer. "We know he's using the railroad to move around, and we know he's been here before. That means he's familiar with the area, probably has some kind of base camp within a day or two of here. So we scout the area, try to find his camp," Tom said, following her logic. "Then what?" "Then we gather evidence and get it to the authorities. At the next major station, if we can prove what he's doing, they'll have to take action." Tom was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the risks and benefits of Sarah's proposal. "It's dangerous," he said finally. "If we're caught snouting around his operation, we won't get a second chance to escape." Sarah understood the danger, but she also understood that doing nothing was ultimately more dangerous than taking action. Morrison wasn't going to lose interest in Willowbrook, and winter would trap them in a situation where they couldn't escape if he decided to return with more men. "I know it's risky," she said, "but I keep thinking about Margaret and about all the other women who might get letters like hers. We have to try." Tom studied her face in the firelight, and Sarah could see him recognizing the same determination that had brought her west in the first place. She wasn't the frightened, helpless woman who had stepped off the train a month ago. She was someone who had learned to shoot, to plan, to act decisively when action was required. "All right," he said finally, "we'll start scouting tomorrow, but we do this carefully, and we don't take any unnecessary risks." Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement. They were about to move from defense to offense, from simply surviving to actively fighting back against the forces that threatened their new life. It was a decision that would change everything, and she was ready for whatever came next. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets of Willowbrook, carrying with it the promise of winter and the unknown challenges that lay ahead. But inside the warm circle of firelight, Sarah and Tom planned their next move with the confidence of partners who had learned to trust each other completely. The alliance they had built over the past weeks had been tested by necessity and strengthened by shared purpose. Now it would be tested by danger, and Sarah felt certain that whatever they faced, they would face it together. The first snowfall came early that year, dusting the mountains around Willowbrook with a thin layer of white that served as a stark reminder of how quickly their window for action was closing. Sarah woke to find frost covering the inside of the windows, and when she stepped outside to gather firewood, her breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air. Winter was no longer a distant threat, but an immediate reality that would soon make travel difficult and dangerous. Tom had spent the previous week scouting the areas north and east of town, following old mining trails and hunting paths that crisscrossed the mountainous terrain. He returned each evening with reports of abandoned campsites and cold fire rings, evidence that people had been moving through the wilderness, but nothing concrete enough to pinpoint Morrison's base of operations. On the morning after the first snow, Tom's persistence finally paid off. He burst through the door of the store with an urgency that immediately caught Sarah's attention, snow still clinging to his coat and hat. "I found them," he said without preamble, moving quickly to warm his hands over the fire. "Morrison's got a camp set up in an old logging station about 8 miles northeast of here, tucked back in a canyon where you can't see it from the main trails." Sarah felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They had been planning for this moment for weeks, but the reality of actually confronting Morrison and his men was more daunting than she had anticipated. "How many men does he have with him?" she asked, setting aside the shirt she had been mending. "I counted at least 6, maybe more. They've got the place fortified with lookouts posted on the high ground. It's clear they're not just passing through. They've been there for a while, and they're planning to stay." Tom moved to the window and pointed toward the northeast, where the mountains rose in a series of jagged peaks. "There's something else. They've got prisoners, Sarah. I saw at least 3 women being held in what looks like a converted bunkhouse. They're being kept under guard." Sarah felt sick. The women Morrison had lured to remote locations with false promises weren't just being robbed and abandoned. They were being held captive, probably to be sold or transported elsewhere for purposes she didn't want to contemplate. "We have to help them," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how impossible the task seemed. 2 people against 6 or more armed men in difficult terrain with winter weather closing in. Tom nodded grimly. "I know, but we can't just charge in there. Morrison's too well prepared and we'd be walking into a trap." Sarah moved to stand beside him, at the window, looking out at the deceptively peaceful landscape that concealed such horror. "What do you suggest?" Tom was quiet for a moment, clearly working through possibilities in his mind. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of someone who had been planning for exactly this situation. "We need help. Real help. From people who know how to handle this kind of thing. The problem is getting word to the right authorities without alerting Morrison that we know about his operation." Sarah understood the dilemma. The nearest law enforcement was probably at the county seat, days away, even in good weather. By the time they could travel there and back with help, Morrison might have moved his prisoners or, worse, decided to eliminate the evidence of his crimes. "What about the railroad?" she asked. "William said he would help spread the word about what Morrison was doing. Maybe he knows someone who could act quickly." Tom's expression brightened slightly. "That's not a bad idea. The train comes through again tomorrow, and Williams might know if there are any federal marshals or territorial authorities working this area." They spent the rest of the day preparing for what might be their only chance to get help before winter made communication impossible. Sarah wrote a detailed letter describing everything they had learned about Morrison's operation, including the location of his camp and the number of prisoners being held there. Tom drew a rough map showing the routes to the canyon and the layout of the fortified position as he had observed it. The next morning brought heavier snow and the distant sound of the approaching train. Sarah and Tom made their way to the platform. Through the accumulating drifts, both of them acutely aware that this might be their last opportunity to get outside help before spring. Conductor Williams was surprised to see them waiting for the train, especially in the deteriorating weather. His weathered face showed immediate concern when Tom handed him their letter and map. "Federal marshals, you say?" Williams scratched his beard thoughtfully. "There's been talk at the depot in Denver about missing persons cases, women disappearing from small towns along the rail lines. Sounds like your Morrison might be connected to a bigger operation than you realized." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the falling snow. If Morrison was part of a larger criminal network, the danger they faced was even greater than they had imagined. "There's a Marshal Jensen working out of the Denver office," Williams continued. "He's been investigating these disappearances, and he's got authority to act anywhere in the territory. I can get this information to him, but it'll take time for him to organize a response." Tom shook his head. "We don't have time. Morrison's got people imprisoned up there right now, and if he gets spooked, there's no telling what he might do." Williams looked at the letter again, his expression troubled. "What are you planning to do?" Sarah answered before Tom could stop her. "We're going to get those women out ourselves." The conductor stared at her as if she had announced her intention to fly to the moon. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's suicide. You're talking about taking on a gang of armed criminals in their own stronghold." "We can't just leave them there," Sarah replied firmly. "Every day we wait is another day those women suffer, and winter's coming. If we don't act soon, we might not get another chance." Tom placed a hand on her arm, his touch gentle but restraining. "Sarah's right about the urgency, but we're not going in blind. We have a plan." Williams looked between them with the expression of a man who had seen too much of human foolishness to be easily surprised, but was still capable of being impressed by unexpected courage. "What kind of plan?" he asked. Tom spread his rough map on the platform, pointing to the various features he had marked. "Morrison's got lookouts here and here, but there's a back way into the canyon that follows an old mine shaft. It's dangerous, but it would let us get close without being seen." Sarah continued the explanation. "The bunkhouse where the prisoners are being held is separate from the main camp. If we can create a diversion to draw the guards away, we might be able to get the women out and lead them to safety." Williams studied the map, his expression skeptical. "And then what? Even if you get them out, Morrison's got horses and knows the terrain. You'll never make it back to town on foot in this weather." Tom smiled grimly. "We're not planning to come back to town. There's an old mining camp about 3 miles south of Morrison's position, closer to the main trail. If we can get the women there, they'll have shelter until help arrives," Sarah added, "and we'll leave signs for Marshal Jensen's men to follow when they get here. They'll know where to find us." The conductor was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing what he was hearing against his own sense of responsibility. Finally, he folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat. "I'll get this to Jensen as fast as I can," he said, "but promise me you won't do anything foolish until you're sure help is coming." Tom and Sarah exchanged a look that Williams correctly interpreted as meaning they would do whatever they thought necessary, regardless of outside help. "Be careful," Williams said as he climbed back onto the train. "The territory needs more people like you, not fewer." As the train pulled away, Sarah and Tom stood on the platform watching it disappear into the swirling snow. They both knew that they had just committed themselves to a course of action that could very well get them killed, but neither of them voiced any second thoughts. "When do we go?" Sarah asked as they walked back toward the store. "Tonight," Tom replied. "The snow will provide cover, and Morrison's men will be less alert in bad weather." They spent the rest of the day in final preparations. Tom checked and rechecked their weapons, making sure Sarah's pistol was loaded and functioning properly. Sarah packed supplies for the rescued prisoners, warm clothing, food, and basic medical supplies in case any of them had been injured. As evening approached, they went over their plan one final time. They would approach Morrison's camp using the old mine shaft route, wait for the change of guard that Tom had observed during his scouting, then create a diversion at the opposite end of the camp from the bunkhouse. While the guards were distracted, they would free the prisoners and lead them to the abandoned mining camp Tom had identified as a safe haven. It was a simple plan, which Tom assured Sarah was a good thing. Complicated plans had too many ways to go wrong, and they would only get one chance to succeed. The snow was falling more heavily by the time they set out, large flakes that reduced visibility but also muffled sound. Tom led the way through the forest, following game trails and old logging roads that he had memorized during his weeks of scouting. Sarah stayed close behind him, her feet finding purchase in the increasingly treacherous footing. The journey to Morrison's camp took longer than expected, partly because of the weather and partly because they had to move carefully to avoid detection. By the time they reached the entrance to the old mine shaft, both of them were exhausted and chilled, despite their heavy clothing. The mine shaft was a black hole in the mountainside, barely wide enough for one person to pass through at a time. Tom had brought lanterns, but they couldn't risk using them until they were well inside the tunnel, away from any possibility of the light being spotted by Morrison's lookouts. Sarah had never been underground before, and the oppressive weight of rock above her head made her feel claustrophobic. The tunnel was rough-hewn and unstable in places, with loose rocks that shifted underfoot and timber supports that creaked ominously as they passed. But Tom had been right about the route. It led directly into the canyon behind Morrison's camp, emerging from a concealed opening that put them within 50 yards of the bunkhouse. They crouched at the mouth of the tunnel, studying the layout of the camp in the flickering light of several campfires. Sarah could see the prisoners' quarters, a low building with barred windows and a single guard posted outside. The main camp was arranged around a larger fire, with men moving back and forth between various shelters and supply areas. "There," Tom whispered, pointing to a stack of supply crates near the edge of the camp. "That's where we'll set the diversion. Those look like ammunition boxes, and if we can get them to catch fire, it should create enough chaos to draw everyone away from the bunkhouse." Sarah nodded, though her mouth was dry with fear. The moment of truth had arrived, and she could no longer pretend that what they were attempting wasn't incredibly dangerous. Tom seemed to sense her apprehension. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can handle the diversion myself, and you can wait here until it's safe to approach the bunkhouse." Sarah shook her head firmly. "We're partners, remember? We do this together." Tom smiled, and even in the dim light, Sarah could see the admiration in his eyes. "All right then, let's go save some lives." They moved through the shadows at the edge of the camp, using the falling snow and the distraction of the guards' conversations to mask their approach. Sarah's heart hammered so loudly in her chest that she was certain everyone in the camp must be able to hear it. But somehow they reached the supply area without being detected. Tom quickly arranged some oil-soaked rags around the base of the ammunition crates, while Sarah kept watch for approaching guards. The plan was to light the fire and then immediately move to the opposite side of the camp, where they could approach the bunkhouse, while everyone's attention was focused on the explosion. Just as Tom was reaching for his matches, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps approaching through the snow and the low murmur of conversation that meant at least two men were heading directly toward their position. She grabbed Tom's arm and pointed toward the approaching sounds. There was no time to complete their sabotage and no way to retreat without being seen. They were about to be discovered, and their carefully planned rescue was about to turn into a fight for their lives. Tom made a quick decision. Instead of trying to hide, he stood up and walked boldly toward the approaching guards, his rifle held casually but ready. "Evening, boys," he said in a conversational tone that somehow managed to sound friendly despite the circumstances. "Jake around? Got some business to discuss with him." The two guards stopped in surprise, clearly not expecting to encounter a stranger walking calmly through their camp. Sarah used their momentary confusion to slip around behind them, her pistol drawn but concealed beneath her coat. "Who the hell are you? one of the guards demanded, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Tom Carter, from down in Willowbrook," Tom replied, still maintaining his casual demeanor. "Jake and I had some unfinished business from his last visit." Sarah could see the guards beginning to relax slightly, apparently deciding that Tom wasn't an immediate threat. That was exactly what he had been hoping for, and it gave her the opening she needed. "Drop your weapons," she said, stepping out of the shadows with her pistol aimed at the nearest guard. "Do it slowly, and nobody gets hurt." The guards spun toward her, their hands automatically reaching for their guns, but Tom was already moving, bringing his rifle up to cover the second man, while Sarah kept her weapon trained on the first. "I wouldn't if I were you," Tom said calmly. "The lady's a very good shot, and I'd hate to see anyone get killed over a misunderstanding." For a moment, the four of them stood frozen in a deadly tableau, each side weighing their chances of surviving. A gunfight. Then Sarah heard Jake Morrison's voice calling from across the camp. "Pete, Charlie, what's all the commotion over there?" The spell was broken. One of the guards made a desperate grab for his weapon, and Sarah fired without hesitation. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and suddenly the entire camp was in motion as men rushed toward the sound of trouble. "Run!" Tom shouted, firing his rifle to keep the second guard pinned down, while Sarah sprinted toward the bunkhouse. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire, shouting, and desperate movement through the swirling snow. Sarah reached the bunkhouse. Just as the guard there was turning to investigate the disturbance, she struck him with the butt of her pistol before he could draw his weapon, and he collapsed into the snow without a sound. The door to the bunkhouse was secured with a heavy wooden bar, which Sarah lifted with strength born of desperation. Inside, she found three women huddled together on rough bunks, their faces showing a mixture of fear and hope as they realized someone had come to rescue them. "We're here to help," Sarah said quickly. "Can you walk? We need to move fast." The women were weak and obviously frightened, but they were able to move under their own power. Sarah led them out of the bunkhouse and toward the mine shaft, while behind them the camp erupted in chaos as Morrison's men tried to figure out what was happening. Tom appeared out of the darkness, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, but otherwise unhurt. "This way," he said, taking the lead as they hurried toward the concealed entrance to the tunnel. Behind them, Sarah could hear Morrison's voice roaring orders, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he organized his men into an effective pursuit. They had to reach the abandoned mining camp before Morrison's men could track them down, and they had to do it in a blizzard that was getting worse by the hour. The journey through the mine shaft was a nightmare of stumbling progress and whispered encouragement. The rescued women were exhausted and traumatized, barely able to keep moving through the treacherous tunnel. But somehow, with Tom leading the way and Sarah bringing up the rear, they made it through the underground passage and emerged into the storm on the other side of the canyon. The abandoned mining camp Tom had identified as their destination was still 3 miles away through increasingly difficult terrain. Sarah could hear their pursuers behind them, the sound of horses and shouting men growing closer despite the muffling effect of the snow. "We're not going to make it," one of the women gasped, collapsing to her knees in the deep snow. Tom turned back, his face grim but determined. "Yes, we are," he said firmly. "We've come too far to give up now." He helped the woman to her feet, and they continued their desperate flight through the storm. Sarah brought up the rear, her pistol ready in case Morrison's men caught up with them before they could reach safety. The abandoned mining camp appeared, out of the swirling snow like a mirage, its collection of weathered buildings offering the promise of shelter and warmth. Tom led them to the largest structure, which had obviously once served as a bunkhouse for the miners. It was in better condition than the other buildings, with a stone fireplace and walls that were still largely intact. As they stumbled inside, Sarah could hear the sound of approaching horses growing louder. Morrison and his men had followed their trail through the snow, and they were closing in fast. "Get them to the back room," Tom said, indicating the rescued women. "There's another way out if we need it." Sarah helped the women to safety, while Tom barricaded the front door and checked his remaining ammunition. They had succeeded in rescuing the prisoners, but now they were trapped in a building, surrounded by armed men who wanted them dead. Outside, Jake Morrison's voice cut through the storm like a blade. "Carter, I know you're in there. You've caused me a lot of trouble, and now you're going to pay for it." Tom positioned himself at a window that gave him a view of the approach to the building. "We're not coming out, Morrison. Those women are under our protection now." Morrison's laughter was cold and without humor. "Protection? You're trapped in there with nowhere to run. All I have to do is wait for you to freeze or starve, and then I'll take back what's mine." Sarah moved to another window, her pistol ready. She could see shapes moving in the snow, Morrison's men positioning themselves around the building. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had succeeded in their primary objective. The women were safe, at least for now. "Marshal Jensen's men are on their way," Tom called out, though Sarah knew it was probably a bluff. "You'd better get out of here while you still can." Morrison's response was a volley of gunfire that shattered the remaining glass in the windows and sent splinters flying from the wooden walls. Sarah ducked behind the stone fireplace, her heart pounding as she realized that their desperate gamble had led them into a siege that they might not survive. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and Sarah could only hope that help would arrive before Morrison decided to finish what he had started. They had saved 3 lives, but the cost of that salvation was still being calculated in the deadly mathematics of survival. The siege stretched through the long winter night, with Morrison's men taking turns firing at the building to keep Tom and Sarah pinned down, while the rescued women huddled in the back room, too traumatized and exhausted to do more than whisper prayers and try to stay warm. Sarah had torn strips from her petticoat to tend to a bullet graze on Tom's shoulder, the wound shallow but bleeding enough to concern her. "How much ammunition do we have left?" she asked quietly, checking the loads in her pistol while Tom kept watch at the window. "Enough for now," Tom replied, though his tight expression suggested their supplies were more limited than he wanted to admit. Morrison's not stupid. He knows he can't afford to waste shots either, not this far from resupply. Sarah moved to check on the 3 women they had rescued. The youngest, who couldn't have been more than 18, had given her name as Emma and spoken in whispered fragments about being lured west by promises of work as a seamstress. The other 2, Alice and Ruth, had similar stories of deception and false hope that ended in captivity, and worse. "How long do you think they'll wait out there?" Alice asked, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. Sarah looked toward Tom, who was studying the storm through a gap in the boarded window. The snow was falling so heavily now that it was difficult to see more than a few yards in any direction, and the wind had picked up to the point where it was difficult to distinguish between natural sounds and potential threats. "Morrison's got the same problem we do," Tom said finally. "This storm is getting worse, and his men are going to start suffering from exposure if they stay out there much longer." As if summoned by his words, Morrison's voice cut through the wind again, closer now and edged with frustration. "Carter, this is your last chance. Send out the women and maybe I'll let you and your lady friend walk away from this." Tom's jaw tightened. "And maybe pigs will learn to fly," he muttered, adjusting his grip on his rifle. Sarah could hear the strain in Morrison's voice, the edge of desperation that suggested he was feeling the pressure of the situation as much as they were. His operation depended on secrecy and mobility, neither of which were possible while he was engaged in an extended standoff in a blizzard. "He's worried about something," she said, moving closer to Tom. "He's not acting like a man who thinks. He holds all the advantages." Tom nodded thoughtfully. The storm's working against him too. His men are spread out in defensive positions, but they can't maintain those positions indefinitely in this weather. Outside, Sarah could hear muffled conversations between Morrison's men, though the words were lost in the wind. She thought she detected a note of complaint, possibly argument, suggesting that not everyone in Morrison's gang was enthusiastic about spending a winter night laying siege to a fortified position. The sound of approaching horses made them both freeze, straining to listen through the storm. Sarah counted at least 6 animals, possibly more, which could mean reinforcements for Morrison or the arrival of help they had been hoping for. "Morrison!" A new voice called out, one Sarah didn't recognize. "Federal Marshal Jensen, you and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender." Sarah felt a surge of hope so intense it made her dizzy. Marshal Jensen had received the message and somehow managed to reach them despite the storm. But her relief was tempered by the realization that they were still caught in the middle of what was about to become a much larger gunfight. Morrison's response was immediate and violent. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the building as his men opened fire on the approaching lawman. Sarah heard shouting, the sound of horses wheeling and stamping, and returned fire from what sounded like at least a dozen rifles. "Stay down!" Tom shouted to the women in the back room as bullets began flying in all directions. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Morrison's men were caught between the marshal's forces and the building where Tom and Sarah had taken refuge, and they quickly found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. Sarah could hear Morrison's voice shouting orders, but his men were already beginning to break and run. A bullet shattered the window frame near Tom's head, sending splinters of wood flying across the room. He returned fire immediately, and Sarah heard a cry of pain from outside that suggested he had found his target. "Federal Marshals!" Jensen's voice called out again. "Anyone in the building, identify yourselves." "Tom Carter and Sarah Mitchell," Tom shouted back. "We have 3 rescued prisoners with us." The gunfire began to taper off as Morrison's men found themselves increasingly unable to maintain their positions. Sarah could hear the sound of horses departing, presumably carrying those gang members who were still able to flee. "Morrison's running!" someone called out, and Sarah heard the thunder of hoofbeats as several horses galloped away into the storm. The sudden silence that followed the departure of Morrison and his remaining men was almost deafening. Sarah found herself straining to listen for sounds of continued danger, but all she could hear was the wind and the muffled voices of the marshals as they secured the area around the building. "You folks in there," Marshal Jensen called out. "We're coming in." The door to the building opened slowly, and Sarah saw a tall man in a heavy coat step inside, his badge visible on his chest and his rifle held ready, but not threatening. Behind him came 2 more lawmen, their faces grim but relieved. "Marshal Jensen," the first man said, removing his hat and shaking the snow from it. "Are any of you hurt?" Sarah looked around at their small group. Tom's shoulder wound needed attention, and the rescued women were clearly suffering from their ordeal. But everyone was alive and relatively unharmed. "We'll be fine," Tom said, setting his rifle aside and moving to help the women from the back room. "These ladies need medical attention and warm clothes, but nothing that can't be handled." Marshal Jensen studied the 3 rescued women with the experienced eye of someone who had seen too much human suffering. "We've been tracking Morrison's operation for months," he said. "You folks probably saved these ladies' lives by getting them out when you did." Emma, the youngest of the rescued women, looked up at Sarah with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought nobody would ever come for us." Sarah felt her own eyes filling with tears as she realized the full impact of what they had accomplished. 3 lives saved, a criminal operation disrupted, and justice finally served on men who had preyed on the vulnerable and desperate. "What happens now?" Tom asked, his arm still around Sarah's shoulders. Marshal Jensen was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through the logistics of their situation. "First, we get everyone somewhere warm and safe. I've got men posted around Morrison's camp, and we'll be rounding up anyone who didn't manage to run. As for these ladies, we'll see that they get back to their families or wherever they want to go." Alice spoke up from where she sat wrapped in a blanket near the fireplace. "I don't have anywhere to go. My family disowned me when I decided to come west, and I don't have money for a train ticket back east." Ruth nodded in agreement. "Same. Here. Morrison told us he'd destroyed all our belongings, and I don't even know if the letters I sent to my sister ever reached her." Sarah felt her heart break for these women who had lost everything in their search for a better life. She looked at Tom, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. "You could stay in Willowbrook," she said impulsively. "It's not much of a town right now, but there's room in the store, and we could use help getting the community back on its feet." Tom nodded in agreement. Sarah's right. It would mean starting over with almost nothing, but at least you'd be safe and have a chance to build something for yourselves. Marshal Jensen looked surprised by the offer. "You're planning to stay in Willowbrook? I thought the town was abandoned." "It was," Tom replied, "but it doesn't have to stay that way. With enough people willing to work hard, it could be a real community again." Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest as she realized that Tom was articulating a dream she hadn't even known she possessed. The idea of rebuilding Willowbrook, of creating a place where people like Alice and Ruth and Emma could start fresh and build meaningful lives, appealed to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "The railroad still comes through twice a week," she added, "and there's good water and decent soil for farming. With the right people, it could work." Emma looked up hopefully. "You really think we could make a go of it? Build something that would last?" "I think," Tom said carefully, "that it's worth trying, but it would be hard work, and there wouldn't be any guarantees." Marshal Jensen smiled for the first time since entering the building. "Well, I'll be damned. Maybe something good will come out of this mess after all." The journey back to Willowbrook took most of the next day, with the marshals providing horses and supplies for everyone. Morrison had escaped, but several of his men had been captured, and Jensen was confident that the criminal network had been significantly disrupted. As their small caravan crested the hill overlooking the ghost town, Sarah felt a strange mixture of emotions. Just weeks ago, the sight of Willowbrook's empty buildings had filled her with despair and disappointment. Now she saw potential where before she had seen only abandonment. "It's not much to look at," Tom said, guiding his horse up beside hers. "No," Sarah agreed, "but it could be." Over the next several weeks, as winter tightened its grip on the mountains around them, their small community began to take shape. Alice proved to have experience with bookkeeping and correspondence, skills that were invaluable as they worked to establish credit with suppliers and communicate with potential new residents. Ruth had been a teacher before coming west, and she immediately began planning for a school that could serve families who might be attracted to the growing settlement. Emma, despite her youth, had a natural talent for organization and an optimistic spirit that proved infectious. She took charge of cleaning and preparing the abandoned buildings for new residents, working with an energy that impressed everyone who met her. Sarah found herself serving as an unofficial leader for their small group, coordinating the work and making decisions about priorities and resources. It was a role she had never imagined herself in, but one that felt natural and right. Tom continued to run the general store, but his responsibilities had expanded to include serving as the community's liaison with the outside world. He corresponded with other towns and settlements, looking for people who might be interested in joining their experiment in rebuilding a dead community. By spring, they had attracted 12 new residents, including 2 families with children and a doctor who had been looking for a place to establish a practice. The school Ruth had planned became a reality, and Sarah found herself teaching needlework and basic domestic skills to the women and girls who had joined their community. The general store expanded to include a small restaurant where Sarah served meals to travelers and new arrivals. Tom built additional sleeping quarters above the store, and Sarah moved into her own room there, though she and Tom spent most of their time together planning and working for the community's future. On a warm evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch of the store, watching the sun set behind the mountains, Tom broached the subject that had been on both their minds for weeks. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I know this isn't how either of us planned our lives to turn out." Sarah felt her heart begin to beat faster, sensing that something important was about to be said. "You came here expecting to marry Samuel Hayes and live the life he promised you in his letters," Tom continued, "and I came here expecting to make my fortune in a booming mining town. Neither of those things happened." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "But what we've built here, what we've created together, it's something I never could have imagined," Tom said, turning to look at her directly. "And I can't imagine trying to build it with anyone else." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. "Are you asking me to marry you, Tom Carter?" Tom's smile was brighter than the sunset behind him. "I suppose I am, though I should warn you that I'm not much of a catch. I'm a failed teacher turned storekeeper in a town that barely exists." Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "And I'm a spinster seamstress from Boston who nearly got us both killed chasing criminals through a blizzard. I'd say we're well matched." Tom reached for her hand, his fingers warm and calloused from honest work. "So, is that a yes?" "That's a yes," Sarah said, leaning closer to him, "though I should probably mention that I have some opinions about how this town should be run." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Tom replied, and kissed her as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Willowbrook. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the newly rebuilt church wearing a simple dress she had sewn herself, surrounded by the community they had helped create. Tom waited for her at the altar, handsome in his best suit and looking happier than she had ever seen him. Alice served as her maid of honor, while Ruth played the small organ they had acquired from a church in Denver. Emma had decorated the sanctuary with wildflowers from the meadows around town, and Dr. Morrison performed the ceremony with the dignity and solemnity the occasion deserved. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come to Willowbrook as a mail-order bride, expecting to marry a stranger, and instead had found herself building a life and a community with a man who had become her true partner in every sense of the word. The reception that followed was held in the general store, with food prepared by the entire community and music provided by a traveling musician who had decided to stay permanently in their growing town. Children ran between the tables while their parents celebrated, and Sarah marveled at how much life had returned to a place that had seemed completely dead just 1 year earlier. As the evening wound down and their guests began to drift away to their homes, Tom and Sarah stood together on the porch of their store, looking out at the lights glowing in windows throughout Willowbrook. "Any regrets?" Tom asked, his arm around her waist. Sarah considered the question seriously. A year ago, she'd been a lonely seamstress in Boston with no prospects and no hope for anything better. Now, she was a married woman in a thriving community that she had helped create, surrounded by friends and filled with purpose. "None at all," she said finally. "This is exactly where I belong." Tom smiled and pulled her closer. "I love you, Mrs. Carter." "I love you too," Sarah replied, and knew that she had finally found the life she had been searching for all along. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.